what seems like, I guess, was about a year and a half or just over a year of negotiations back and forth between the Canadian government, the U.S. government, the Mexican government, we now have what's called the USMCA, that some people, I guess, are referring to it as NAFTA 2.0.
It's certainly a lot less different than, at some points, it's looked like it would be. Obviously, it's a lot less different than not having NAFTA. It's a lot different from not having NAFTA. But yeah, at the end of the day, after a year and a half, there's some changes here. Some of them are potentially significant, although we don't know. But for the most part, it looks a lot like NAFTA, and for that, give thanks.
A former prime minister recently said that there's no conservative way and no liberal way to negotiate a free trade agreement. Could they have done anything differently? This was former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney that said this.
I don't actually agree with that. First of all, I think they made some errors in the course of the negotiations. I don't think the retaliatory tariffs, for example, were a very good idea. There are some provisions in this tweaked agreement, updated agreement, that I don't think a conservative government would necessarily have signed on to. For example, adopting International Labour Organization standards and putting them in the trade agreement. Maybe they would have agreed with that or not, I'm not sure. Some of the environmental stuff, even the auto content quotas, which were kind of rigged in a way that are made to benefit Canada and the United States at the expense of Mexico. Would a free marketer have agreed with that? I'm not so sure.
So what does this do, I guess? How does this road ahead look? Because now we're dealing with an election year. We're seeing the country looking a little more blue. How does this fare for the Liberals?
Well, I think this will play on balance for them. It's hard to know at this point because sometimes things can come back to bite you if there are things in here that people are more alarmed about than on a first reading. But I think there'll be an enormous sense of relief that the thing was signed, that it appears, at least for now, that we're out of Donald Trump's sightlines, and rightly or wrongly, I probably think a fair degree rightly, the government will get credit for having kind of battled them to a draw. You know, they didn't get a lot of what they were looking for. The Canadian government didn't get a lot of what they were looking for going into the negotiations. The Trump administration didn't get all that it was looking for. We kept some things that I wish we hadn't. They opened up supply management a smidgen. I would have liked to have seen much broader opening there. But as I say, when you think of some of the things that might have, in Donald Trump's dreams have gone in there, it could have been a lot worse, and they'll probably get some credit electorally for that.
Okay, on the heels of that, to give our Liberal government credit as well, I mean, there's talk that the LNG project will go ahead as well. So I'm assuming that all of this will bode well for the current government.
Those are two certainly good things for the economy and good things for the incumbent government when you're presiding over it. How much they can claim any credit for the LNG, I think, is another matter, but that's the way politics works. But they still have some fairly major files still on their desks. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is still going to be bedeviling them for some time to come. And the related issue of carbon pricing, which they've set themselves a January 1st, 2019 deadline. Those are both much easier said than done. Not impossible that they could pull both of those out of the fire as well. So all three of these things, NAFTA, pipelines, and carbon price, could well be the death of this government, but could be their salvation. It's just going to depend how they play out. But they will be wrestling with those two latter files for the next several months.
Going back to the USMCA trade agreement and the negotiations and the issues that our government had put forth.
Which, by the way, I refuse to call USMCA.
You're still calling it NAFTA?
I'm calling it NAFTA.
We'll let you have it, Andrew Coyne. What was the reasoning behind our government putting forth these social issues that we see or hear nothing about now in the final agreement?
To be fair to them, there is references to them. They just don't have the separate chapters. It's not as big a deal as perhaps they were hoping. So there was something they wanted a chapter on indigenous rights. They wanted a chapter on gender. They wanted a chapter on climate change. They wanted the United States to dismantle so-called right-to-work laws, which are state laws that would be very hard for the federal government to have anything to say about. So they definitely had at least for appearance's sake, a large agenda going in. Now, how much of that was just so they could have a demand that they could then trade away, and how much of that was just playing to the local audience, the domestic audience, to say, see, we're fighting for these issues that you care about, you Liberal voters? I don't know, but they didn't get very much of that. But I don't want to say they got nothing. There is language in there, certainly around labor and environmental things. And that's not coincidental because these things have perhaps a liberal left-wing appeal, but they also have just a protectionist appeal. It's great to sort of talk about labor standards if your ambition is basically to put the boots to Mexico, because Mexico's workers are paid less than ours, and this is a great way to kind of say, well, it's not because we're being protectionist, it's because we're upholding labor standards. So there was more congeniality on some of these issues than I think maybe either side wants to let on. Where I think the Trudeau government and the Trump government actually saw eye to eye on a few of these issues.
Your thoughts on the language with respect to a 3-month, I guess, notice of trading with non-market countries?
There's a couple of things there at the end of the treaty or the updated treaty, whatever you want to call it, that are kind
the
of
NAFTA.
The NAFTA, that are kind of strange and potentially concerning. You have to be careful with these things because you never know who's zooming who. So there's a clause in there that says, yeah, if any of the parties wants to sign a free trade treaty with a non-market country, and how that's defined is an interesting question, but it's pretty clearly meant to include China, for example. Then they have to not only give notice and not only let them see the final text, but quote unquote, any of the parties can withdraw from the agreement, can kick Canada out of the agreement. Now, they can do that anyway. Anybody can withdraw from the agreement on 6 months' notice anyway. But it certainly seems to be set up, at least politically, that the U.S. would be kind of sitting in judgment of Canada if it tried to sign a free trade treaty with China. You know, what the actual impact of that will be, I don't know, but I don't like the sound of it. The troubling thing is that there's really nobody in Canada to raise much of a stink about this, because the NDP doesn't want to sign a free trade treaty with China because it's free trade, and the Conservatives don't want to sign a free trade treaty with China because it's China. So, and I'm not even sure if I want to sign a free trade treaty with China, but I want our country to have the sovereign right to do so if it chooses. So I'd like to hear more about that clause and what it's about. There's another one that talks about currency manipulation and competitive devaluation, and we'll have to be monitoring each other and have some sort of 3-country committee looking at each other's macroeconomic policies and dispute panels, et cetera. And again, it probably is meaningless. It's probably we'll just talk to each other. But anytime I see anybody saying we can't have our own exchange rate policy, these are the two absolute pillars of Canadian prosperity, in my view, in the last couple of decades, is free trade, where we've been signing free trade treaties with everybody around the world, and a floating exchange rate, which is just key to sort of adjusting to economic conditions. And I get very shirty if anybody's threatening either of those.
Indulge me here for a moment. Let's speculate, or if you could speculate, if you will. Is Congress going to give this a 2 thumbs up?
I would think so. I think particularly from the American perspective, it doesn't look like that big a deal, not that much of a change. There's a little bit of a protectionist edge on the auto thing. I don't like it. They increased North American content quotas, and this thing where if our exports rise fast enough, then they can put the tariffs on. I think neither of those will prove to be much of a binding constraint, but they're worrisome from a pure free trade standpoint, which is my standpoint. From an American congressman's standpoint, I don't think anybody's going to have much of an issue with it. And I would think, yes, I think there'll be a great sigh of relief in the Congress.